Dan Perkins Media presents a unique and exciting program. Truth Starts Now, a conversation with Dan Perkins. The left has taken away your rights to freedom of speech. Truth Starts Now is a platform for you to regain your voice. America and Americans will be better off if we can have civil and respectful conversations about the day's important issues.
Welcome to this Hallmark edition of a new show called Truth Starts Now, a conversation with Dan Perkins on the danperkinsmedia.org network. Joining us today is a very important gentleman who I've had an opportunity to interview before and was so impressed with him and his book, I decided that when we're launching the new network, we need to do it with Tom. So I want to introduce you to Tom Baker, who has written a book called The Fall of the FBI. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Glad to be with you, Dan.
Now, you wrote this book and you wrote it into three sections: the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is the first of three shows that will go into detail of your book in the three sections: the good, the bad, and the ugly. My objective here is to bring you on board to tell your 33-year history story of working directly for the FBI and also working as a consultant to the FBI after you retired. So let's start off with, tell us about the good of the FBI.
Well, Dan, the good was sometimes like it is portrayed in the movies. I was always, as a young man growing up, my grandfather and a couple of my uncles had been police officers. I was intrigued by their stories, their adventures, catching the bad guys, bringing justice to the world. So I was very idealistic, and I decided to go into law enforcement. And then I was directed by some people, fortunately, to the FBI. And that's where my story begins when I joined the FBI.
What year was that?
That was a long time ago, in 1965. And what happened then, we went to training, new agents training in Washington, D.C. It was quite different than it is today. This was just a short time before the J. Edgar Hoover building was built, the current FBI headquarters. It was just a short time before the new FBI Academy was built, which for many years was always referred to as the new Academy. So in those days, like decades of new agents before me, we had our training in the Department of Justice building. FBI headquarters, believe it or not, in those days, fit right inside the Justice building, a monumental building on Pennsylvania Avenue between 9th and 10th Street with these gigantic, heavy metal doors. And I went down there to Washington, reported in. The strange thing was, looking back on it, I wasn't intimidated by the walking into that monstrous building and taking on this responsibility. I was enthusiastic. It was the enthusiasm of youth, and it was also a little bit of naivety, I have come to realize. Our training took place in a classroom which still exists in that building, in the Justice building, which had been used for many things over the years. It was the same class. That classroom was used as a courtroom in the middle of World War II to try the Nazi saboteurs by a military tribunal, and they were found guilty, and a number of them were executed. And then in the late 1950s, Jimmy Stewart, the famous actor, filmed many of the scenes of the movie, The FBI Story, in that very room where we had our initial training.
I want to go back just a little bit because you talked about how you were impressed and you used the word naivete. Would you say you were a patriot at that time?
Without a doubt, yes. I loved America. I'm the son and the grandson of immigrants. A working class family, and the best of them became police officers. So I was definitely patriotic. I also believed, as almost all the new recruits to the FBI did, and the vast majority of the American people, I believed in the justice system. I believed those accused were most often guilty. In fact, I believed at that time that if you're accused, you are guilty. I had that mindset. And I believed those people in jail belonged in jail. I have since learned, and of course I address this in the middle part of the book, the bad, that justice is imperfect, that there are people in jail perhaps who shouldn't be there, and there are a lot of people out of jail who should be in jail, to put it rather simply. But at first, I was very idealistic, as most are when they enter a career path like that.
Do you think, Tom, that perhaps some of your contemporaries might have gone into the military, but had similar feelings about their honor and their duty for their country?
Absolutely, without a doubt. There were 20 some of us in my new agents training class, and back then they were all males, all young men, relatively young men. We did have a lot of people who had spent several years in the military, and I would say the majority of the class were law school graduates. I was not a law school graduate, and I was ready to. I mean, my mindset was one, and as I say, enthusiastic and naive. I was ready to listen to what my instructors had to say. As I get into the book in some detail, we were blessed. I really do mean that. We had wonderful instructors. Most of our classroom time in that classroom in Washington, D.C. was spent on the Constitution. We would leave for several days at a time and go to the Marine Corps base at Quantico, the old FBI academy. The new academy hadn't been completed yet, for firearms training and defensive tactics for a few days at a time. But the classroom training in Washington for 3 or 4 months was on the Constitution, of course, mainly on the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. And then as regards law enforcement, the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment. And our instructors were FBI agents who were attorneys. They were fabulous instructors, and they imbued us with a love of the Constitution. And what kind of surprised me at the time, because I was hearing some of this for the first time, many of my classmates who were law school graduates commented that this instruction and this information they were receiving was better than anything they had heard in law school.
Let's take that thought for a moment and move 30 years forward. Are the recruits today going into the FBI Academy different than you when you went in?
I'm afraid to say from everything I know they are. Let me just say this. At that time, although the FBI had counterintelligence responsibilities, it was a law enforcement organization with a law enforcement mindset. The instructors, these legal instructors we had, told us that we should not see the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments to the Constitution as obstacles that had to be overcome, that we should embrace them. And that was part of the ethos that was taught to us, that we were the guardians. Part of our role was not only to apprehend the bad guys, but was to protect the civil rights, and that's the word that was used in those days, the civil rights of Americans. And we were at the end of the training session, we were given by one of our legal instructors a pocket-sized copy of the Constitution, and he told us to keep it in our breast pocket with us, and that if you have it in your breast pocket and you're interviewing a citizen or you're searching somebody's home, if you have that Constitution with you, you're very unlikely to go astray. You're very unlikely to make mistakes. You're very unlikely to violate anybody's rights. And that may seem corny today to some, but most of us did take it seriously. We did embrace the Constitution. And for a long time, many of us did carry it with us in our pocket.
Well, we have a show on our network called Moms Across America, and we've been they're our second oldest show on the network, and every week they promote a source to get a copy of that pocket document that is both the Constitution but the Bill of Rights, that we need to get that in people's hands, because when we were going to school, we might have been taught some of that stuff in school, but not anymore. I'm looking at what you were talking about, the difference in the people. There's also, would it be fair to say, that there's also a significant difference in the leadership of the FBI?
Yes, the people and the leadership. What I learned dwelling on this matter of the Constitution for a moment, what I came to learn several years ago was that they no longer gave new agents a copy of the Constitution, and I inquired about it, and I was told it was done for budget reasons. So in several editorials that I've written and in my book, I harp on this a lot. And I've been in contact with FBI executives over the past years about my concerns. And that is one change that I'm told has been made quite recently. They now give a copy of the Constitution not only to every new agent, but to every new FBI employee. It's a small step, but it's a symbolic step that's very important. So that change has been made. The other underlying thing is this thing in our society, for want of a better term, people call wokeness. And the vast pool, and former Attorney General Bill Barr has addressed this issue specifically, the vast pool that people are being recruited into the FBI and other agencies like the DOJ, they're coming from out of this woke culture. So they start, or a lot of them, start off with a certain assumption, a certain set of beliefs, and then they are bending those towards the rules, or bending the rules towards their beliefs. And that's how some of the abuses, which have been well documented by the House Judiciary Committee and others, have been allowed to come about. We stuck, and later, while I was an agent, the Levy guidelines were created, the first set of guidelines for domestic investigations. And the bottom line in those guidelines, to put it very simply, is we will investigate people or groups who engage in violence or advocate violence. But if your speech is totally protected, so you can say hateful things and things that aren't true, but that's protected speech. The only time the FBI or the federal government in any form should be looking at that speech is when it leads to violence or advocates violence. And unfortunately, that guideline has been disregarded time and time again in the last several years.
Growing up and watching on television, going to the movies, whenever you would see a movie or a TV show about the FBI, one of the things that we would always see was the labs, how they could investigate, and they had fingerprints and guns and all these things, that they were truly investigators. When did they move from being investigators to, for lack of a better description, intimidators?
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned that thing about the lab and fingerprints. A small sub-theme of my book is the increased professionalism of law enforcement in general in this country, and I think the FBI does deserve credit for that. The things in the fingerprint program, DNA, other things, a lot of the credit for this does go to the FBI, and it has helped law enforcement broadly in this country. The change, which I have talked to a lot of people about, came about at a very significant moment right after the September 11th attacks. And I'd like to address that in some detail when we come back.
The FBI, by a book written by Tom Baker, and it's called The Fall of the FBI. Tom, where can people get the book?
The book's available on Amazon, and of course at Barnes & Noble and wherever you buy books. The Fall of the FBI, you can get it on Amazon.
We'll be right back after this commercial message.
Inflation for most people is causing them to use their credit cards to try and make up for income shortfalls. How big is this problem? In the second quarter of 2022, Americans added $46 billion to their credit card balances. Some of that could be you. The Federal Reserve Consumer Credit Report showed that the rate of interest on credit cards went from 14.56 to 16.65%. Those Americans struggling with credit card debt saw their delinquency rates escalate from 1.66% to 1.81%. The Cambridge Debt Consolidation Program may be able to help you reduce the interest rates by 2/3 and cut your time to pay off the debt from 30 years to as little as 5 years. If you're struggling and you want professional and objective help getting your credit house in order, then call 1-855-435-2066 or...
Welcome back, and we're talking with Tom Baker, author of the book, The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. So our first show out of 3 is dealing with the good. As you came in the 60s, what were some examples of what you thought were the good that the agency was doing?
The objective was, as I said, to get the bad guys, to put it simply, but it was a law enforcement agency with a law enforcement mindset, but we were strictly trained to operate within the guide rails of the Constitution. And the civil rights of Americans were very much of concern. And in the process of that, there were a lot of adventures that, as I say, could have been made into movies, and some of them were made into movies. In fact, I recall when I was in my first office of assignment in Jacksonville, Florida, the day Martin Luther King was shot. And of course, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was widespread unrest in the country. The national decision-making authorities, i.e. the president and the attorney general, turned to the FBI and they wanted us to do something with all these riots going on. And we didn't have the guidelines. The guidelines came a few years later for domestic security investigations. So we didn't know, quite frankly, the hierarchy and us down on the street level didn't know exactly what our role was to be. I was in Jacksonville at the time, and Martin Luther King's only brother, who was also a minister, was in Jacksonville, and he organized a mourners march. So there were 10,000 people in the mourners march, and most of the agents in the field office were sent to monitor, and that's the term that was used, monitor the march. And of course, we didn't have the guidelines. Were they there to protect the people's civil rights? Were they there to watch out for radicals? Why were they there? But they were there watching. Guidelines were not clear. A few hours before the march was underway, to get underway, we got information that the Ku Klux Klan, former domestic terrorist group, some might say, was massing a few blocks north of the office to stage a counter demonstration. So the few of us that were left in the office, and I would say not much more than a half dozen agents, were sent down on the street to watch the Klansmen. Their route of march was taking them right beside our building, the federal building, where in those days, believe it or not, our cars were parallel parked on the curb. We spread out along the street. I was at the lower end of the street. The Klansmen came shuffling down. There were a mixed group of all men, young and old. They were not in their notorious white robes. They were just in coveralls and flannel shirts. A lot of them had with them brown paper bags and thermoses, their lunch, it turns out, for that day. And I was watching and looking in different directions. Once again, we didn't know quite why we were there, other than just to monitor the march. That's what the national authorities wanted us to do. And at one point, action to my left drew my attention, and I saw an agent, a much older man, punching a Klansman right across the face like that. I turned and ran up the street. Myself, that agent, and another agent, we grabbed the Klansman, arrested him. The other Klansmen, who outnumbered us 50-1, started yelling and cursing at us, but none of them moved forward to fight us, thank goodness, because they outnumbered us. And I think we were all resolved we weren't going to draw a weapon on them if they just were using their fists. We took this fellow up to the office, and the agent said that he had thrown a punch at him. So he was charged and arrested for assaulting a federal officer. Well, I have to confess, and I do this in the book, I didn't quite believe the story, because what I saw with my own eyes, I saw the FBI agent punch the Klansman. That's all I saw. Kept my own counsel. A trial came about some months later, in that same building. Federal courthouse was on the top floor. And at the very last moment, like something in a movie, the Jacksonville City Police Department, who were about to merge with the sheriff's office, but at that moment they were city police department. They had an intelligence unit, and it turns out they were secreted in a building right across the street from where I was standing, with their cameras, 16mm cameras, focused up the street at the Klansmen marching down the hill. And there, for the jury and for everyone to see, in living color, was the Klansman throw a punch at the agent, and the agent, the older man, blocked the punch and then came back and punched the Klansman. The film showed exactly what the older agent had said. So that was the first lesson for me as a young man. You can't always believe your own eyes.
Interesting. So any other examples of when you thought you did the right thing?
Oh, there are many examples of that. And there was many adventures as a young man. I was so young then. I was 23 years old, but I looked a lot younger. we would get a lot of cases, miscellaneous cases, criminal cases of all kinds, the newer agents, and then we'd spend time helping the more senior agents on their more serious cases, bank robberies, extortions, and kidnappings when they happen. And I remember one morning I had this complaint form, a new case assigned to me, and it was about impersonation of a federal officer. And a woman in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, had complained that a kid had come to her house and he seemed very nosy, and he showed her something saying FBI. And she called in this complaint that this kid was impersonating an FBI agent. Well, I knew who the kid was because I remember having gone to her house 2 days before to ask her about a neighbor who was the girlfriend of a fugitive. I kept that to myself, but I realized this is very embarrassing. But I grew, I gained more experience, and after a period of time, I moved on from Jacksonville, Florida, moved to other offices, and eventually to New York City, where I was engaged in some very significant investigations of organized crime, which we could make another movie about that.
At those early years, was the FBI's mission, for a lack of a better description, was the mission to investigate as opposed to prosecute?
The mission was, well, we worked very closely with the U.S. attorneys, and we were a true team, and the mission was to prosecute. It was not to inquire into people's thinking. And later, we had which is very significant in American history and forgotten by many, we had the Pike Commission and the Church Commission, and they came up with a whole proposal of reforms. This led Attorney General Levy to the first set of guidelines, which were very helpful, that enumerate and lay out how investigations would be conducted, domestic terrorism investigations particularly, but other domestic investigations. Those hearings eventually led to, in 1978, the passage of the FISA Act, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which provided a statutory way to gather intelligence on foreign agents resident in this country. Presidents in the past, going back to FDR and Eisenhower and Truman and LBJ, they had all wanted the FBI to gather intelligence on foreign agents here, but there were no guidelines. The FISA Act was wonderful in that it provided the guidelines. It provided a court, a secret court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which was created by the Act, whereby the FBI, principally the FBI, could get warrants to surveil foreign agents in this country. It's a very low standard of probable cause because the FISA Act is a significant thing, was intended to gather intelligence, not to gather evidence for prosecution, but it provided a legal way of doing that. And it was only to be used on foreigners. Now, that started in 1978. The FBI director at the time was Judge William Webster. It was his first year as FBI director. He stayed for almost 10 years. And he set the gold standard. That first year, we now know, because the statistics were published later, there were 200 FISA warrants. In subsequent years, it got up to almost 1,000. But it was always used only on foreigners and only to gather intelligence. Then we had September 11th. And like other things, there were a lot of unintended consequences happened in the action, the response to September 11th. But one of them was the FISA Act was amended and amended again and amended again over the subsequent years. So now the FISA Act is used against U.S. citizens, as we saw in the Russian collusion case, where there were 4 FISA warrants over a period of a year used against an American Carter Page, who we now know did absolutely nothing wrong. So it's an abuse. And that's a reform that Congress can undertake, to go back and look at the FISA Act again and amend it so that it can be restored to its original purpose, to gather intelligence, but only on foreigners resident in this country, not on U.S. persons. If a U.S. person, and by U.S. person, another term of art, it's not just U.S. citizens, it includes legal resident aliens and U.S. corporations. If they're suspected of engaging in terrorism or espionage, they can be investigated under various criminal statutes where the evidence has to meet a higher standard. or the investigation has to meet a higher standard, and the evidence can be used in court for prosecution.
So we've got about 2 minutes left. We're discussing with Tom Baker about the first section of his book, The Fall of the FBI, the good part. Whenever we have major events, whether it's the Second World War or the Korean War or the attack of 9/11, and the rules get changed, and you talked about some of the changes that were made in the rules at the FBI. Is it hard sometimes for some agents to get behind the changes that are made?
Yes, absolutely. And Dan, you really put it in perspective as a historian. This phenomenon that we've seen in our lifetime in recent decades in the U.S. has happened before, and it goes all the way back to the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, who most of us revere as a great, if not the greatest president ever in the United States, and the man who led to the liberation of the slaves and many other ones and preserved the Union, yet in that crisis, he undertook action that we now know was wrong, was unconstitutional. His suspension of habeas corpus is denounced by historians. So that happened even then in the American Civil War. And then in World War II, we know also another crisis. We had been attacked at Pearl Harbor, and there was an overreaction in that crisis and the abuse of the civil rights of Japanese American citizens. People of Japanese descent who were U.S. citizens were interned and their property was seized and their lives were disrupted. That was a terrible violation of their civil rights. We all know that now. And I submit to you that similar things happened in the reaction to September 11th when we allowed Pfizer to be used against American citizens, and where Bob Mueller, and maybe we'll talk about this in the next segment, changed the entire ethos of the FBI away from a swear to tell the truth law enforcement organization to a intelligence-driven agency.
Yeah, I think that's, I'm looking forward to that discussion at our next visit. We've been having this fascinating discussion with Tom Baker, who is the author of The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. Thank you for joining us today, Tom, and we'll look forward to your next visit.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for all you do.
You're welcome. We'll be right back after these messages.
Thank you for joining us today, and we'd like to hear your comments or questions. So go to bwradionetwork.com. That's bwradionetwork.com, and give us your questions or comments. And thanks for joining us today.